This story was shared to us by a listener. I want to thank him for sharing his story. My situation is unique because I found out about my wife cheating. After she passed away, my wife grew up with both parents. They went to church every Sunday. Since she was born, we've been married for 13 years and dating. Since we were 18 years old, we have 3 kids in a house. The kids were 8, 11, and 13. When she passed away in 2020, we made around the same amount for years. She made between $3,600 to $4,000 a month as an RN. I made between $3,000 to $5,000 a month as a wholesale supplier. I saw several signs and blatantly ignored them. Here are some of the signs I ignored. Her phone was on the floor. I went to pick it up and put it on the charger. She jumped out of her sleep and asked me what I'm doing with her phone. I thought to myself, the only reason she would react in such a way if she's cheating. Another sign, we were talking in the front room. She showed me a video clip of a guy in New York who does sexual massages. I grabbed the phone from her so I can view it myself. She started going crazy and fighting me over it. I eventually gave it back to her, but the biggest sign I ignored, she said she was going to a club one night. She didn't come home until 4:30 in the morning. We had a big argument about coming home. So late, the only reason I didn't jump to conclusions she was cheating. In the first year of our marriage, I stayed out until 5 in the morning with my friend. We went to the club, then chilled outside talking. I wasn't with the girl, nor was I cheating. My phone ends up dying. So she couldn't get in contact with me. When I finally came home, she didn't accuse me of cheating and said she was concerned. She called the cops to report me missing, but she had to wait 24 hours. The last sign before she passed away, maybe 4 to 6 days prior, I asked her if I could use her phone to post clothes on Facebook for advertising. She was hesitant, then started going over her phone. I said to myself, that's something I would do if I were cheating. I reassured her I wouldn't go through her phone because I didn't want to know if she was cheating. Besides, I trust her. She gave me her phone and I went into the room. After 10 minutes of using her phone and posting on Instagram and Facebook, I decided to go in her direct message on Instagram. I went to a conversation she had with her best friend. I said to myself, if she's cheating, her best friend would know. I read a little bit of the conversation. It wasn't anything there. I went to the text messages and noticed text messages by a trainer. I saw a little bit of the conversation, then closed out because I felt bad about going through her phone. After I told her I wouldn't, that's when she walked to the room to see if I was using her phone. I told her I was almost done, but I found it odd again. I said to myself, she's showing signs of a cheater. We had a conversation months prior to her passing about cheating. I asked her if I cheated on her, what would she do? Her reply, I don't know because I have never dealt with you cheating before. I found it odd because we started dating at 18. We've always agreed the relationship is over. If one of us cheats, I told her, I'd rather you divorce me because I don't want to know. I don't know how I would react. I read stories from men murdering their family or abusing their spouse and going to jail. I have listened to songs about a guy committing suicide after discovering his wife cheating. Another song about a guy dying in a car crash after going through his girl's phone. I didn't want to be in that predicament. So, I convinced myself not wanting to know is the best option. All the signs I ignored were within the last year of her passing. She passed away in September of 2020. When I got home to tell the kids, we started crying and the kids were screaming. It's the most gut-wrenching experience in my life. It still haunts me till this day. When I think about it, I got her phone from my youngest son and asked if they knew the password. The youngest one told me the code. I told myself I would keep my word by not going through her phone, even in death. I planned on deleting the text messages when I got time to do it. I announced her passing on Facebook. I planned to keep her memory alive by posting pictures every day. I decided to bury her next to my mother, where we agreed to be buried after my mother passing. About 5 days after she passed, a guy sends her a video message from the Caribbean islands where she went on vacation. I decided to respond to him as her to find out if anything went on between them. By the conversation, they sent video messages back and forth. How are you doing conversations? I decided to call her friend and ask her about it because they went on vacation together. My wife's girlfriend, Nancy, played it off and said they took his information because they wanted a travel guide. The next time they went, she told me, your wife loved you. The day after the funeral, I wanted to post a video of her instead of a picture. I went through the trash area of her phone. As I'm scrolling, I noticed a naked picture of a man. I thought to myself, if you go down the rabbit hole, it's no turning back, but I couldn't turn a blind eye now. That's when I decided to go through her phone. When I went to her Facebook Messenger, I didn't see anything. Just conversations with her friends. I went through her text messages. It was a treasure trove of information. I read the whole conversation with the personal trainer. As I'm going back in the conversation, I found sexting, nudes, and texts saying, "I can't talk right now because he's next to me." As I'm reading everything, I became furious and started having a nervous breakdown. I'm thinking to myself, I wish she was here so I could confront her. I felt like she got away without talking to me. Now I'm brainstorming about everything. I see the personal trainer's address. I decided to Google it because it seemed familiar, and it was. I remember going to his apartment to pick up her gym clothes months prior to their sexual encounter. I felt disrespected and violated. I decided to call her best friends because I wanted answers. I had to piece the story together as much as possible. I knew they wouldn't give me any information. So, I had to trick them by threatening to expose their infidelity on social media. I called her best friend Nancy again because she dealt with her every day. She didn't want to tell me anything, but she felt compelled since she didn't want my wife's information exposed. She told me after the club one night, my wife went to a hotel and almost had sex with a guy, but he couldn't get aroused. I guess she thought that wouldn't piss me off. The friend didn't know about the guy I found in her phone. The guy she told me about was different. The friend explained when I went to the club with my wife, they would see each other and wouldn't say anything. Now I'm steaming in my head because I'm in the same club with the guy sleeping with my wife. I asked Nancy why she didn't divorce me. If she was going to cheat, she said, because she felt like you were a good father. After I heard that, I felt used and manipulated for her to stay with me because she didn't want to co-parent and handle financial obligations by herself was an insult. Especially when she's making $8,000 a month as an APRN. She got her master's in November 2019 and started working a new job in January 2020, 9 months before she passed away. I decided to call her friends to find out what went on behind my back. I barely got any information after threatening to expose her. One person told me she used to flirt with a coworker. That's it. As the days went on, after discovering everything, I read the text messages with all our friends. Nancy told my wife about her cousin being interested in her. My wife told her to give him her number. Now I'm furious as hell. I decided to call her again to speak about the situation. I'm screaming and yelling obscenities. She's gasping and sighing on the phone. I told Nancy she will never see the kids again. Now she's hurt and making excuses for her involvement by saying she got nothing to do with it. I told her, "You're the one who told my wife your cousin was interested, and exchanged numbers." A few days later, I decided to get in contact with Nancy's boyfriend and tell him about Nancy going to hotels with other men. All the information in my wife's phone, I gave him one of the guy's phone numbers so he could get in contact with him. I told him not to react right away, just get access to her phone and go through it because she switched the names around. He calls me back 2 weeks later and tells me about the aftermath. He said he waited 10 days to confront her. He went through a Facebook Messenger since he had access to it, but he didn't see much, only little signs. When he went to confront her at the hiking trail, he grabbed the phone from her and she panicked. Then said she's going to call the cops. So, he decided to break the phone since he's the one paying for it. As I'm going through my wife's phone some more, I see conversations with multiple men. I see one conversation that alarmed me with her friend, Amy. It implied the guy she almost had sex with was interested in a threesome, which seemed to intrigue my wife. I remember a conversation we had around the time. My wife asked me if I would be interested in a threesome. I told her no because it goes against my religious beliefs. Even though I would be interested, I think she was using me as a moral gauge. I saw Cash App payments from the guy to her after she went out to eat with him. Plus, I remember the day because she said she would bring some food home from the restaurant, but she changed her mind because the food wasn't good. I saw conversations with other friends saying I was jealous of her. I never specified in detail why I'm jealous of her. I'm left to assume it's over me trying to prevent her from doing something that costs her her life. She's telling associates I'm mean and nasty to her because countless arguments over finances and cleaning. She wouldn't clean up the house and spent most of her money on vacations, shopping and partying. While my money was tied up paying bills, I'm not going to lie. I was verbally abusive to her, but I felt justified in my actions because I wanted more out of life than living check to check and living in a nasty house. It was countless insults behind my back by her, to my sisters and boss. After she died and I had to take care of all the bills, I found out she was 2 months behind on the car insurance. The washer and dryer were not paid off after I gave her half of the money to take care of it. A month later, I told her the washing machine wasn't working. Her reply: it was stopped working after we paid it off. She took 15 days to pay the mortgage certain amounts after I gave her half the money to pay it before the grace period. To make matters worse, I found out she was smoking marijuana. That startled me because since teenagers we agreed to never smoke marijuana. If I knew she was smoking, I would have told her to stop or I'll leave. I decided to tell 2 of my kids about their mother's infidelity, and the not-so-kind words she expresses about her kids to Nancy's cousin. The oldest one got extremely mad and told me to remove all her pictures from the wall. The 11-year-old seemed indifferent about it. His main concern was beating up the guys she slept with. I had to explain to him why it's inappropriate when she slept with them willingly. I never told the youngest one what his mother did. I felt like he wouldn't understand. Sometimes he feels left out because his other brothers know, plus he was confused with the removal of her pictures. He said it felt like I didn't love his mother. Now I'm wrestling with the idea of moving her casket. I don't want her next to my mother. I don't want to be buried next to her. I decided to research if she could be transferred to her father's cemetery and the cost. When I decided to tell her brother about my decision, he objected to it, asking why I never had a full conversation with him or the mother over their daughter's infidelity. It felt awkward telling them since their perception of her was a righteous woman. I felt like it would be a tough pill to swallow. Her mother heard about her daughter cheating indirectly. Her niece told her I found information on her phone. I told her brother about her indiscretions in a roundabout way, but the phone hung up without me knowing. I was talking on the phone to nobody for 10 to 15 minutes. I took it as a sign. He wasn't meant to know the details. When I told my sisters about moving her, they told me not to make any rash decisions and give it a year. My wife's family doesn't want her casket moved. I decided to leave her next to my mother, but I'm not getting her a headstone, which some of the family members are upset about. I won't allow anybody else to get her one. If they decide to do it without my consent, I'll have it removed. I haven't been able to visit my mother since September the 26th, 2020. I used to visit her several times within a week. I stopped going after my wife was buried next to her. I feel like if I go see my mother, I'll be paying my respects to her as well. 3 weeks after my wife died, I met a girl and went out on a date with her and we hit it off. She ends up getting pregnant 2 months later, but the timing was horrible, especially dealing with my kids and public perception. 2 months later, after my girlfriend announced her pregnancy, Nancy decided to make a long post on Facebook using a fake page, disparaging me by saying my wife took care of the finances and kids. She stated I was in the house with the kids but I didn't take care of them. Also, she said I wasn't capable of putting half the money down on a house. Plus hinted at me cheating on my wife because it's no way my new girlfriend popped up pregnant 2 months after my wife died. One of my sisters felt the same way and asked questions in a roundabout way to debunk their theory. My daughter was born in July 2021, so my girlfriend had to get pregnant in October or November. She lived in California before coming back to Connecticut to help her mother. She came back in June 2020, 2 months before my wife passed away. Besides, my wife and girlfriend are friends with my female boss I work for at a car wash. So, it's no way possible for me to get away with cheating. I would be paranoid to pull it off. Plus, the most important part, I don't want to go to my kids and tell them the reason daddy had to leave the house because I cheated. My girlfriend planned to go back to California with her mother in a few months. She only came back to help her mother sell the condo. After getting pregnant, she stayed with me to give birth to my daughter. I'm not a big believer in karma, but somehow I feel like the string of events was timed. My wife became an RN in 2007 and started making $3,600 a month. She went back to school in 2014 to get her master's. She received her master's in late 2019. She started her new job as an APRN in January of 2020, making $8,000 a month. For the 13 years we were married, I didn't know about her life insurance policy. I knew she had one, but I didn't know the details. After she passed, I looked into everything. Her job from 2014 to 2019, she had an insurance policy for both of us for $40,000 and less for the kids. When she started her new job in 2020, she only had life insurance policy on herself for 6 figures. It shocked me. She didn't have one for the kids and took the minimum policy through her job. I'm assuming she wanted to keep as much money for herself in her paycheck. I remember having an argument with her about not having life insurance to bury me. I told her I'm not dying anytime soon, and if I do, just wrap me up and bury me without a casket. So it's not costly. At the time I was looking at life insurance with my credit union, but I was procrastinating. For years, I prevented my wife from having surgery done. When my mother died in December of 2019, I was depressed and devastated. I decided she can get surgery work done because I didn't want to control her life, but I told her I prefer her not to do it. If she does it, she's on her own. I am not going to the appointments. I don't want to know anything because I don't approve of the surgery. I was trying to deter her from doing it on her own will. She decides to do it anyway and passed away 9 days after the surgery. I feel like she had the surgery done to build up her self-esteem when she's out cheating. Recently, I found more information on my wife's phone. It's hundreds of videos of her talking to her friends. The videos are 10 to 15 minutes long, but I found a video of her talking about being in love with a third guy. She insinuated they had sex, but I don't have anything concrete because I didn't watch all the videos. Most of the conversation with the friends are about work. I don't want to invest a large amount of time watching videos all day. If her family gets upset over the headstone, I'll probably watch all the videos to cement why she can't get one. In the end, I think about it every day and get upset, especially not being able to confront her. My girlfriend says I should be happy at the end of the day. I got the house, life insurance, and the kids. After thinking about it, she's right. If my wife was alive and I found out, my life would have been upside down. I would have to stay with one of my sisters and start over. I didn't know anything about hiring a private investigator or getting evidence to prove infidelity for divorce until listening to stories on Reddit. I probably wouldn't have been able to force the sale of the house since the house is solely in her name. My credit was bad at the time and I didn't want to ruin our chances, but I put half the payment down and paid half the mortgage every month. I blindly trusted her because she went to church all her life. She held many titles in church. I thought she was incapable of cheating. If she did cheat, she probably slept with one guy. But I don't know how many men she slept with, and I'm left to conclude it could have been over 10 guys because my girlfriend found Facebook conversations on paper from 2011, 2013, and 2016 with her flirting. She was supposed to meet up with one guy, but one of the kids got sick. So, in the end, I got the house, 6 figures, the kids, and a girlfriend who will clean up and do. My wife and I were married for 10 years. I was my wife's first, and as I believed, her only sexual partner. We tied the knot when we were both 22 years old. And the incident that I'm about to share happened 10 years later when we were 32. My wife informed me that she was going on a vacation with her sister, but during the week she was away, her messages became strange and infrequent. I grew anxious about her well-being, and upon her return, her behavior only confirmed my fears. Just before the COVID-19 outbreak hit the United States, my wife mentioned feeling unwell and decided to schedule a doctor's appointment. However, she went to a second appointment without disclosing any details to me. Concerned about her health, I felt left in the dark and desperately wanted answers, so I searched her car for any appointment summaries or clues that could give me some insight. To my shock, I discovered an open STD test and a visit summary for her doctor revealing that she tested positive for herpes. My world began to crumble, and I was overwhelmed with emotions. I sat in her car for a while, staring at the trees around me, trying to process what I had just found. After discovering that my wife had tested positive for herpes, I knew that I could no longer be intimate with her. I felt scared and worried about my own health, so I decided to stay with my mother for a few days while waiting for my own test results. My wife seemed preoccupied with her own concerns and hardly noticed my absence. Thankfully, my results came back negative, meaning that I hadn't contracted the virus from her, nor had I passed it on to her. However, I still had concerns that needed addressing. I was frustrated that she hadn't informed me about her diagnosis, and I had many questions. Despite this, I realized that some answers were unnecessary, and my wife needed to confront the reality of the situation. Knowing how my wife contracted herpes wasn't a priority for me. What mattered was that she had it. During her vacation with her sister, they worked together in the same office, which gave me an idea. I received an email invitation to a work party, and it included the email addresses of my wife's colleagues and bosses. I took the opportunity to email them a picture of my wife's diagnosis, and added a message that she had brought home a present from her vacation. The response was overwhelming. Before my wife could find out what I had done, her sister called me, asking what was going on. I told her everything. When her sister called me, she admitted that she hadn't been with my wife the whole time they were on vacation. Initially, she thought it was unfair of me to share my wife's private issue with her coworkers. However, after I expressed my frustrations to her and mentioned the possibility of divorce, she began to support my actions. Suddenly, my wife appeared outside and started banging on the car window. She looked furious and terrified, screaming and crying incoherent words. I got out of the car, and she began hitting me until I revealed that I knew she had cheated on me. At that point, she couldn't hold herself together. My wife was clearly overwhelmed, and had probably not fully come to terms with her STD or her infidelity. When I revealed that I knew about her affair and the STD, she broke down in tears, trying to apologize and explain that she had used protection. But I wasn't willing to listen. I felt deeply betrayed, and I knew I could never be intimate with her again. Eventually, she went back inside defeated after I told her to pack her things and leave. Her sister, who had been on the phone during our confrontation, came over to help her pack and offer some words of encouragement about the future. My wife's motivation completely vanished when she tried to return to work. She was met with a barrage of backlash and shame from her coworkers for what she had done to me. Whether it was to her face or notes left on her desk, she was insulted, called out, and slandered. She could only endure one day of work before quitting. Her sister has been very quiet since then. And as far as I know, my wife still lives with her. I wouldn't be surprised if she's avoiding dating for a while or having trouble forgiving herself. As for me, I consider myself fortunate to have done my own investigation, and to have separated myself from her while I figured out what I needed to know. In the end, I was able to dodge a bullet. I hope that she practices safe sex and discloses both her diagnosis and infidelity to her partners. I am deeply sorry for what happened to you, OP. Your wife's actions were extremely disrespectful and breached the trust you had in her. It will be difficult for her to overcome the mistakes she made. You trusted her when you let her go on vacation without you, but she took advantage of that trust by having sexual relations with another man. It's a form of cosmic justice that she contracted an STD. It's fortunate that she didn't try to initiate sexual contact with you before you found out about what happened. You definitely avoided a disastrous outcome. It's a relief to know that she couldn't conceal her diagnosis and was forced to confront the shame she deserved for cheating on her husband. Any woman who thinks she needs someone else to love her needs a serious wake-up call. True love is meant to be between two people who communicate openly and choose to love each other unconditionally instead of taking advantage of their partner's trust. OP, I wish you all the best. You made the right decision by investigating and finding out the truth. Thank you for sharing your story. Let's move on to the second story of the day. Last Valentine's Day marked the end of my 7-year marriage with my 33-year-old wife. She was supposed to finish work at 5 p.m., but at 4:50 p.m., she sent me a text saying that her aunt had a date for Valentine's Day, and since she had trouble finding dates, she felt obligated to babysit her kids for her. I suggested that I could meet her there, but she told me it wasn't necessary. Her aunt was uncomfortable with men being at her house because her children were recovering from their abusive father, who had been out of the picture for some time. This conversation really upset me, but I decided to be just as selfless as my wife on this special day. Initially, I believed her story for about an hour. However, things changed when she posted a status update revealing her location. She made sure to block me and our mutual friends from seeing it, but she overlooked one person, her 15-year-old cousin, the child she was supposed to be babysitting. The cousin actually messaged me to ask how I was doing and shared some troubling news. The cousin showed me a screenshot of my wife's status and location, which indicated that she was having a lovely Valentine's Day at a fancy restaurant. The cousin was quite observant and noticed that my wife didn't tag me or include a photo of us together, which was unusual. Due to these inconsistencies, She suspected that something was amiss and decided to inform me. I didn't disclose to the cousin that my wife had used her as a cover-up for the babysitting lie, but I thanked her instead. Afterward, I checked the family locator app, which we never argued about. Since my wife's phone wasn't at the restaurant she claimed to be at and we were always together, I decided to dig a little deeper. I messaged one of my wife's coworkers on Facebook to inquire if she knew anything. She immediately revealed that something was likely happening between my wife and a colleague from the office. She mentioned that they would exchange work documents at each other's cubicles, but she suspected that they were actually passing handwritten notes. Additionally, she mentioned that they ate lunch together in the small office kitchen every day. It appeared that my wife and her colleague were attempting to conceal their relationship and portray themselves as nothing more than coworkers. I was surprised by how easy it was to gather information from people. Had I been oblivious all along? Although I couldn't check my wife's phone, I informed her coworker about my wife's fabricated Valentine's Day story and her current location in a different neighborhood. The coworker asked if she was at Sunny Day Development, which stunned me as it was the exact location where the colleague, lived. Apparently, my wife was at his house. I remembered showing her that spot once during a party. My wife's icon hovered over the neighborhood, and she said it was definitely close enough to be his house. I had enough. I thanked her and got off social media. I started throwing my wife's clothes and belongings out the window. Loose clothes were strewn all over the yard and roof. It started raining before she got home, and I thought karma was just giving me an extra hand. I wrote a note to put on our front door that read, "Happy Valentine's Day. Don't bother coming back ever again." When she got home late, I could hear her screaming and freaking out. She pounded on the door and repeatedly rang the doorbell, but I had barricaded myself inside. I could hear her talking on the phone with her mother and father, and it seemed like they were surprised that she was locked out of her own house with her clothes strewn across the yard. She insisted that she didn't know why this was happening, but eventually she broke down and admitted to lying about having a date with someone else. She had asked her father for help in moving her belongings elsewhere. I could only imagine that her parents questioned her motives, but all she could say was that she didn't know. She had refrained from telling me about the situation as she feared my reaction. When she finally disclosed what had happened over the phone with her father, she sounded remorseful and ashamed of her actions, like a pitiful little girl who had made a grave mistake by lying and on her spouse, thinking she could get away with it. Her father arrived to help her and I stepped outside to confront them both. I told them that I had learned of her infidelity while she was away, and despite her tearful denials and accusations of exaggeration, I challenged her to prove me wrong by showing me her messages with the other person involved. I confronted her about the other person involved, and her face turned pale when I mentioned his real name. Despite her denial of having any messages with him, I could sense her father's disappointment, and I asked him if he believed that she was lying. He hesitated, feeling embarrassed, but eventually agreed with me. This caused her to start screaming and wailing, eventually dropping to the ground. I sternly told her to gather herself because she was an adult who made the conscious decision to cheat on me and deceive me on Valentine's Day. Now she had to face the consequences of her actions. Her devastation was evident, and I could sense that she didn't want our marriage to end that night. Although she didn't want our marriage to end, she made the decision not to return to our home, leaving behind her beloved dog without the opportunity to say goodbye. Fortunately, we never had children because it would have been even more heartbreaking. Her actions serve as a lesson to others to carefully consider the consequences of betraying the trust of the person who matters most in their life. Every action has its own set of repercussions, and she had to face the consequences of hers. She stayed with her parents for some time, but they were extremely disappointed and skeptical of her words. She was not allowed to leave her parents' house unless it was for work. And even then, she had to return promptly as any delay was unacceptable. I'm sorry to hear about your wife's betrayal on Valentine's Day. Although it's just like any other day, the fact that it's associated with true love makes it even more hurtful. I'm relieved that you were able to uncover the truth through your investigation. It's fortunate that the person your wife used in her lie came forward, unaware of her involvement in the deception. Your ex-wife turned a kind gesture into a falsehood that was difficult to accept. It's impossible to sustain a relationship built on such a foundation of dishonesty. It's difficult to even imagine how one could have a healthy relationship with your ex after what she did. She needs to mature and understand the value of loyalty and honesty in a relationship. Without those qualities, she doesn't deserve the benefits of a romantic partnership. Despite the difficulty, you made the right decision to distance yourself from her. I wish you the best of luck moving forward. Thank you all for taking the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed listening, please feel free to like and subscribe if you haven't already. Also comment below with your thoughts on what happened. You think you know someone, right? I mean, after years of marriage, kids, the whole 9 yards. But then one little DNA kit turned my world upside down. Her birthday was coming up, and I thought, hey, let's do something fun, something different. So I got us those ancestry kits. Trace your roots, see if you're secretly a Viking or something. She seemed off about it, hesitant, but she did it, swabbed her cheek, sent it off. Just a bit of fun, I thought. Then the results came. It was supposed to be a revelation about her family tree, but it turned out to be about ours. There I was, staring at a screen that might as well have been a sledgehammer to my life. None of the kids, not one of them, was mine. The blood drained from my face, my heart pounded like it wanted out. I mean, how does this happen? 3 kids and none of them mine? So I dug deeper, because once you fall down that rabbit hole, you can't stop. The more I found, the worse it got. Each kid had a different dad. Imagine that. My life, my family, it was a lie. A show put on by the one person I trusted most. Anger, yeah, there was plenty of that. But it was more than that. It was this cold, sinking feeling that I'd been played for a fool. So I did what any sane person would do when they feel cornered and betrayed. I hired a private investigator. She was lying about this, what else was there? The pie, a guy who looked like he chewed nails for breakfast, got to work. And what he found, it wasn't pretty. My wife, the mother of my kids, had a string of affairs stretching back years. Photos, messages, the kind of proof that you can't just explain away. Sitting there in my living room, with my whole marriage scattered around me in photos and papers, I realized something. I'd been living in a fantasy, thinking I had a family, a loving wife. But it was all smoke and mirrors. This wasn't just about infidelity or betrayal. This was about my life, my identity. Who was I, if not the husband, the father I thought I was? That's when the idea started forming. A dark seed in the pit of my stomach. If my life was going to fall apart, I wasn't going down alone. She had to pay for this, for the years she stole from me, the lies, the deceit. I know what you're thinking. Revenge is a road that goes nowhere good. But at that moment, it was the only road I could see. Revenge, they say, is a dish best served cold. I'd always thought that was just a fancy line from a movie. But there I was, planning my own cold dish. Started with the money. You see, if things went south, I didn't want to be left with empty pockets. So I began moving my assets bit by bit, nothing too obvious, just enough to secure my future. Then I turned my attention to her, to the woman who made a fool out of me. It wasn't about grand gestures of revenge, no. It was the little things, small enough to make her question her own mind. I'd move her keys, switch off the alarm she'd set, hide that novel she was reading. It sounds petty, but you see, it's the little things that get under your skin. But the real game changer was when I sent those DNA results to the biological fathers. Anonymous, of course. I wanted to see her world crumble piece by piece. And it did. First, there was the wealthy businessman, the real father of our oldest. He showed up one day, out of the blue, demanding answers. I watched from a distance as they argued in the driveway, her face white as a sheet. That was just the beginning. Her fortress started to fall apart. I could see the cracks appearing, the doubt, the fear. It was in the way she looked over her shoulder, the way her voice shook on the phone. I'd planted the seeds, and now I was watching them grow. And then there was the isolation. Friends, family, I made sure the rumors reached them all. Whispers of affairs, of lies, of things no one wants to hear about a loved one. One by one, they started to distance themselves from her. She was toxic, and they didn't want to get poisoned. Watching her like this, you'd think I'd feel triumphant, powerful even. But the truth? It was emptier than I'd expected. Each step of my plan, each little victory, it didn't bring the satisfaction I thought it would. Instead, there was this hollow feeling like I was carving out pieces of myself along with her. But I couldn't stop, not after coming this far. I had to see it through, had to make her feel just a fraction of the pain she'd caused me. It was no longer just about revenge, it was a lesson. A punishment for her betrayal. So I kept at it, watching as the life we'd built together, the life she'd lied about, fell apart around her. And as I stood there, in the shadows of our crumbling world, I realized something. Revenge doesn't heal old wounds, it just cuts new ones. The plot thickens, right? There I was, setting the stage for the grand finale of a marriage that was nothing but a sham. I went a step further, a step darker. I planted evidence to make it look like she was mixed up in some shady business. It wasn't hard to do. A few forged documents, an anonymous tip to the cops, and the stage was set. I watched from the shadows as the police handcuffed her. She was confused, scared, emotions I'd become all too familiar with. But things don't always go as planned. She was released, no solid evidence to hold her. Still, the seed of doubt was planted, not just in her mind but in the eyes of everyone who knew her. The whispers started, the sideways glances, she was tainted, even if she was innocent of this particular crime. And then she began to suspect. She knew someone was orchestrating her downfall, but she couldn't put the pieces together. I almost felt sorry for her, almost. But every time that feeling crept up, I remembered the lies, the betrayal. The divorce papers were the next act. I filed, citing her infidelity. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, signing those papers, admitting to the world that my marriage was a lie. But it was necessary, a part of the plan. The proceedings were brutal, every affair, every lie was dragged into the light. I watched as her face crumbled, not just from guilt but from the realization that it was me pulling the strings. She tried to reconcile after that, said she was sorry, that she'd change. But it was too late for sorry. My heart had turned to stone. I looked her in the eye and told her it was over. No emotion, just cold, hard finality. The custody battle was a massacre. The biological father stepped in, and with the evidence of her affairs, her instability, it was an open and shut case. She lost the kids, the only innocent victims in this twisted game. But the real blow came when she realized it was me. The man she'd married, the father to her children, the one she'd betrayed. I was her nemesis. The look in her eyes, that mix of bewilderment and betrayal, it was a punch to the gut. But I couldn't let myself feel. Feelings were what got me into this mess. In the end, she was left with nothing. No husband, no kids, no friends. Her world, once filled with lies and deceit, was now just an empty shell. Looking back, I wonder if it was worth it. The satisfaction of seeing her brought to justice was overshadowed by the emptiness of my own victory. I'd won the battle, but at what cost? My family was broken, my heart was cold, and the future was a bleak, unknown path. But I couldn't dwell on that. This was the path I'd chosen, driven by a need for justice, for retribution. And now I had to live with it. You ever hear the saying, be careful what you wish for? Well, I got exactly what I wished for, and let me tell you, it's not all it's cracked up to be. There she was, my once loving wife, scraping the bottom of the barrel. My plan had worked a little too well. She was broke, thanks to the divorce settlement I had meticulously engineered to leave her with next to nothing. Her reputation? In tatters. The rumors I'd spread, the half-truths and full lies had done their job. She was poison to anyone who knew her name. Jobs? No one would hire her. I saw her, going from one interview to another, hope flickering in her eyes, only to be snuffed out time and again. Then came the desperation. I watched from the shadows as she reached out to her past lovers, the ones she thought would save her. But they turned their backs, one after another. They wanted nothing to do with the woman who had lied to them as much as she had to me. It wasn't long before the threatening messages started. Anonymous, of course. I didn't send them, but I didn't stop them either. Fear became her constant companion, and I watched, part of me satisfied, part of me horrified at what I had become. The day she got evicted from her house, that was a turning point. She stood there on the curb, her life stuffed into a few boxes and bags, the home we had shared, where our kids had grown, now just a building with locked doors to her. It was a sight that would break most men, but I was past breaking. I was the architect of her downfall, and there was no turning back. I kept tabs on her, following her descent into a life I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. She moved into a dingy motel, the kind of place you wouldn't want to spend a night in. There, in that small, grim room, the magnitude of what I had done hit me. I had wanted to make her pay, to feel the pain and betrayal I had felt. But this was something else. This was not just a woman scorned. This was a life destroyed. And the worst part? I was the one who had destroyed it. Sure, she had cheated, lied, torn our family apart. But as I watched her in that motel room, I couldn't help but feel that I had gone too far. Revenge, it turns out, is a double-edged sword. Cuts your enemy, sure, but it cuts you too deep into the bone. I realized then that this was no longer about her or what she had done. It was about me, about what I had become in my quest for vengeance. I had lost sight of who I was, of what mattered. I was no hero in this story. I was just another villain. So there we were, both of us lost in our own ways, both of us paying the price for our actions. Her, living in a rundown motel, and me watching from a distance, a spectator to the tragedy I had authored. It was a bitter lesson, but one I had to learn the hard way. Revenge doesn't heal old wounds, it just opens new ones. Life's funny, you know? Just when you think you've got it all figured out, it throws you a curveball. There she was, my wife, living in some rundown motel, the kind of place where hope goes to die. She was scraping by, a shadow of the woman she used to be. And me? I was watching from a distance, feeling this hollow satisfaction. I had won, but that tasted like ash. Then, out of the blue, this guy shows up. Someone from her past. A blast from the life she had before me. He was slick, the kind of guy you don't trust at first glance. But she was desperate, drowning, and he was offering a lifeline. She took it, of course. What choice did she have? This guy, he wasn't just an old flame. He was trouble with a capital T, I could see it. But she was too far gone, too lost in her own mess to notice. He started pulling her into his world. A world of quick fixes and shady deals. It was like watching a train wreck in slow motion. He had her wrapped around his finger, manipulating her into doing things, illegal things, for a quick buck. It was all about the money for him. And her? She was just a pawn in his game. I found out about it, the whole sordid affair. Part of me wanted to step in to save her from herself. But another part of me, the part that was still burning with betrayal and anger, wanted to let it play out. So I did nothing. I just watched as she spiraled further down the rabbit hole. Before long, she was involved in some high-risk scheme cooked up by this guy. It was bad news, the kind of thing that gets you in deep trouble with the wrong kind of people. She was in over her head, playing a dangerous game with no idea of the rules. I remember thinking, this is it. She's finally hit rock bottom. It was a mix of pity and relief. Pity for the woman I once loved, who was now caught in a web of her own making. And relief that it wasn't my problem anymore. But even then, deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. You don't just walk away from a life you've shared with someone. Not completely. The memories, the good times, they have a way of creeping up on you when you least expect it. So there I was, caught between my desire for revenge and the remnants of the love I once felt for her. It was a tough spot, watching someone you once cared about destroying themselves. But I had made my choice, and now I had to live with it. In the end, life isn't black and white. It's a million shades of gray, and sometimes you find yourself lost in the shadows, wondering how you got there and where you go next. Life's a gamble, they say. You roll the dice, take your chances. But what happens when every roll comes up snake eyes? That's where she was, my wife, caught in a losing streak that just wouldn't quit. The scheme, her big shot at redemption, it blew up in her face. Big time. There she was, mixed up in something that had danger written all over it. And as luck would have it, it all went south. She managed to get out, but it was a close call. Too close. Now she was on the run, a fugitive with the law snapping at her heels. It was like something out of a bad movie, except it was real and she was the star. Me? I heard about her mess, of course. It was all over town, the whispers, the rumors. Part of me thought I should feel something, guilt maybe, or even a twinge of concern. But there was nothing. Just a numb indifference. I checked out, emotionally packed my bags and left the building. She tried to reach out to the kids, a desperate move from a desperate woman. But they wanted none of it. They'd heard the stories, seen the evidence. To them, she was a stranger. A ghost from a past they wanted to forget. It was harsh, but that's how it was. You reap what you sow. There she was, all alone with nowhere to turn. I heard she was thinking of turning herself in, making a clean breast of it. Maybe she thought it would be a fresh start, a way to wipe the slate clean. But fate, it seems, had other ideas. Before she could make her move, they got to her. The people she'd crossed, the ones she'd wronged in that failed scheme. They weren't the forgiving type. No, they were out for blood, and she was their target. The news of her capture reached me, like whispers through the grapevine. Did I consider stepping in? Playing the hero? Saving her from the mess she'd made? The thought crossed my mind, but it was a fleeting one. I was done, out of the game. This was her fight, not mine. So I did nothing. I stayed out of it, let the chips fall where they may. Some would call it cold, heartless even. But when you've been burned as bad as I had, the heat just doesn't touch you anymore. There was a time when I would have done anything for her, moved heaven and earth to make her happy. But that time was gone. A distant memory faded by lies and betrayal. I was a different man now, hardened, cynical. In the end, it was a sad state of affairs. She was out there alone, facing the consequences of her actions, and I was here living a life that no longer had her in it. It was a strange feeling, knowing that the person you once shared everything with was now a stranger, a ghost haunting the edges of your life. But that's life, isn't it? Unpredictable, unforgiving, a game of chance where sometimes you lose more than you bargained for. Ever heard the phrase, when it rains, it pours? Well, for her, it was a never-ending storm. There she was, finally out of the clutches of those she'd wronged, but what was left? Her life, once a picture-perfect postcard, was now just a tattered, faded photograph. Ruined. She was free, sure, but it was the freedom of a bird with broken wings. She was haunted, you know? Not by ghosts or anything like that, but by her own past. Everywhere she looked, she saw shadows of the mistakes she'd made. Paranoia became her constant companion, a nagging whisper in her ear that wouldn't quiet down. It was a sad sight, seeing someone who used to be so full of life now jumping at shadows. And me? I was putting the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. The divorce papers, once just a threat, were now a reality. Signing them felt surreal, like I was signing off a part of my life, a chapter that was closing forever. It was done. The ties that bound us, the promises we made, all severed with a few strokes of a pen. But life goes on, right? You can't just stop living, even when your world's turned upside down. So I found solace where I could, in my work, in the little things that made up my day-to-day life. It was a fresh start, a chance to rebuild from the ground up. It's funny how life works. One day you're married, you've got a family, a plan. The next, you're single, starting over, the past just a memory. But it's not just about moving on, it's about finding peace. Peace with what happened, peace with yourself. She tried to start over too, but it wasn't easy. The past has a way of clinging to you like a stubborn stain that just won't wash out. She struggled, fought to find her footing in a world that seemed to have turned its back on her. I'd be lying if I said I didn't think about her, about what she was going through. But it was like thinking about someone from another life, a distant, faded echo of a time that was gone. I had my path, she had hers. Our roads had diverged, and there was no turning back. In the end, I found a kind of peace, a quiet acceptance of how things turned out. I threw myself into my work, found joy in the little things. A good cup of coffee, a quiet evening, the satisfaction of a job well done. It was a simple life, but it was mine. She, on the other hand, was still searching, still trying to find her way out of the labyrinth of her own making. It's not easy, starting over when you're carrying the weight of your past on your shoulders. But that's the thing about life, it goes on whether you're ready for it or not. So there we were, two people who once shared everything, now living worlds apart. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but sometimes that's just how the story goes. Starting over. Sounds simple, right? Just a matter of picking yourself up, dusting off, and stepping into a new day. But for her, it was like climbing a mountain with no peak in sight. She tried, God knows she did. Tried to leave the past behind, to carve out a new path for herself. But the past, it's like a shadow that never quite leaves you alone. She was a pariah, shunned by on her. Finding a job? That was a joke. Even the most menial tasks were denied to her. Her reputation preceding her like a bad smell. And her health, it wasn't holding up either. Stress, they say, can break you down, and it was doing a number on her. The once vibrant, lively woman I knew was fading, wilting under the weight of her new reality. Then came the bombshell, the cruel twist of fate that would break her once and for all. She found out, somehow, someway she learned that it was me pulling the strings, that I was the architect of her downfall. The look in her eyes when she confronted me, it was something I'll never forget. Betrayal, pain, a deep, unspoken sorrow. It was like looking into the eyes of someone who's lost everything. That confrontation, it was the last time I saw her. She was broken, a shell of the woman she once was. There was no fight left in her, no fiery comeback or vengeful plot. Just a deep, overwhelming sense of defeat. As for me, I thought I'd feel victorious, knowing that she finally understood the extent of my revenge. But victory? That feeling never came. Instead, there was this hollow emptiness, a realization that in my quest to bring her down, I'd lost a part of myself too. The last I heard, she was living on the fringes, a ghost wandering through a life that had slipped through her fingers. Her choices, her actions, they had led her here. But I couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt, a sense of responsibility for the path she was on. Life has a way of teaching you lessons you didn't know you needed to learn. I thought revenge would bring closure, but all it brought was more pain, more regret. Looking back, I wonder if things could have been different, if there was a path we could have taken that wouldn't have led us here. But wishing, it doesn't change the past. It doesn't heal the wounds we've inflicted on each other. We were both casualties in a war that neither of us won, a war that left us both broken in our own ways. In the end, this isn't a story of triumph or redemption. It's a tale of loss, of love gone wrong, and the price we pay for the choices we make. It's about the scars that we carry, the memories that haunt us, and the hard truth that sometimes, there's no such I was sitting in my office late Friday night reviewing several candidates who had heard there was a job opening in our office. I worked as a regional manager for a chemical company that supplied chemicals for weed control, fertilizer, and water retention in the soil. Our livelihood depended on the farmers who grew or fed us what we ate. Because of our commitment to sustainability, we were the first company whose products were recognized as 100% environmentally friendly. The husbands of 2 of my office staff were promoted, resulting in their resignations. Both were moving within the next 3 months. We needed to find their replacements as soon as possible. Our sales department covered 8 states located in the heart of flyover country. Sales growth this year had exceeded expectations. Kathy, my executive assistant, looked into my office and said, "Ed, all 8 people have confirmed their interview times for Monday. I'm off, so good night." Every Thursday, I traveled to one of the states in my region for a half-day sales meeting on Friday before heading home. As a result, Thursday evening turned into an evening where my wife would go out with the girls. Over the years, it has become worth the considerable expense of paying for a babysitter. My weekly visits provided our sales reps with the personal contact they needed to help them with their performance and performance issues. This paid big dividends over the years. I never lost a single person in 8 years, and that was considered an accomplishment for the company. I just got back today and had time to check on a few cases before heading home. The company has been trying to get me to give up this part of my job for several years now. But I found that time alone gives me a chance to think things through in my own way. With a know-it-all wife and 3 kids, the quiet time spent driving was invaluable. It also saved our branch from having to hire a sales manager. I had experience working in a budget-cutting environment, and I wanted to keep it that way. Our children are in junior and senior high school, and the oldest girl, my pride and joy, is graduating in the fall and attending Southeast Missouri State University. My employer has awarded her a full scholarship. My youngest daughter had just turned 16 and was busy studying for her GED. My wife of 20 years, Grace, was working as an executive assistant district attorney, and had held that position the year before our youngest daughter was born. He had just been offered a new position as a lawyer in the federal government, and he accepted. The Fed seemed to like his uncompromising hardball approach. He'd be a fool to turn it down since it was double the money. He was supposed to start work in 4 months. I could never understand him. He was about the same age as me, but he never married. I didn't know for sure, but contrary to rumors, I didn't think he was gay. Every second weekend of the month for the past 15 years, my 3 children have been taken away by my parents so that my wife and I could have some time to ourselves. When they started doing this, my wife and I found ourselves at a crossroads in our marriage. My parents felt that we needed some time to ourselves without the kids. I have to admit it was the greatest gift they could have given us because it gave my wife and I time to find ourselves again. If they hadn't done that, we would have been another example of divorce. They had about 3 months before it was supposed to be over, as Amy, my oldest daughter, was going to work in our senator's office in Washington, D.C. for the summer before starting her undergraduate degree in political science. Some time ago, my father, with my permission, bought each of our 3 children a kit from Ancestry.com and jokingly submitted them for testing. According to their instructions, we knew there would only be a match if any of their relatives had submitted their DNA to the same program. My kids talked to me about it and I gave my approval, saying that we all have distant relatives that we don't remember or know about. Perhaps this would open up a new adventure for us. Amy offered to surprise their mother until we got the results. We knew it could take up to 5 or 6 months to get an answer. This weekend, we traveled to Nashville to visit the Grand Ole Opry, and we're returning home on. My wife was the one who planned this special trip as a way to create another memory in our life's journey. I met my wife Grace in my final year of university at a soccer match. No, I wasn't one of the players on the field. I was one of those no-name grunts selling overpriced food to the spectators in the stands. She was one of the youngest daughters of the medical coach, so she always got free tickets. She had an argument with her beau over some stupidity that one of them took the wrong way. The jostling alternated with the pushing. I found myself in the center of things. She pushed him and stepped aside. He saw her movement and hit me with all his weight from the back. I fell and rolled down the concrete stairs and the tray of food rolled with me. The next thing I knew, I woke up in the hospital with my head bandaged. According to the doctor, I had 25 stitches because of my spit-up forehead. Grace must have felt guilty because she came every day to make sure I was okay. She met my whole family before I started seeing daylight again. They told me later that I was in a coma for almost a week because of internal injuries. When the fog around my vision began to clear, I saw an unknown goddess standing in front of me. At first I thought I had arrived at the pearly gates and she was my angel guide. Then my friend appeared beside her, clear as light. Esmeralda was not impressed with the vision standing beside her. I closed my eyes and drifted into sleep, praying that Esmeralda wouldn't be there when I woke up and that it would all be a dream. When I woke up, the dream was still around, but Esmeralda wasn't. Esmeralda decided she had to find a new sweetheart to mess around with her. God favored my prayer. Grace stood next to me, never asking me anything while I was slowly getting my life together. I never asked her, but eventually we started dating. One thing led to another. When we graduated, I went into sales and she found her first job as a management assistant. At one of the family reunions, her younger cousin asked why she was still single, and she said because Ed hadn't proposed to me. 3 months later, I stood at the altar and watched the goddess walk toward me. 5 feet 8 inches tall with long blonde hair, deep bluish, almost black eyes, and a figure that made men drool. Grace and I married. By the 5th year, we had both reached the point where we were ready to break up. To this day, I couldn't understand why or how we were separated. For all I knew, she didn't understand either. We had just stopped at Lambert's on the way home. To me, this restaurant lived off its reputation. What they liked most was throwing huge buns across the room into the air to be caught by customers, because all the other food was outdated, overcooked crap. We stopped at this tourist trap because it reminded my wife of her mother's home cooking. Need I say more? For some reason, my wife reached over and turned off our sound system. When she did that, it meant she wanted to discuss something serious. I reached into my jacket pocket and turned on the recorder. It was a trick I used to maintain confidentiality when I thought I might need to confirm what I'd said later. Ed, my wife Grace asked, have you ever thought about having an affair? My first thought was what brought this on. My second was why is she asking this? Does she have a child or does she know someone who does? Why does she think it's important enough to talk about it right now? I had to clear my mind of the questions before I could speak. Grace, let's be honest, I said. Everyone's been thinking about the affair. The better question is whether I've ever acted on it, and the answer is no. Why not? Asked Grace. Because I said my vows when we got married, I said. They meant something to me and they still do. As society's attitudes have changed, Grace says, marriage vows no longer have the value they used to. I think you should forget about them and seriously consider finding a mistress with whom you would be compatible. If you're worried about your own guilt, consider that I personally allow you to have such a woman with my unconditional blessing. Having such a woman can help you to appreciate our relationship even more, as well as give you a deeper understanding of what we are. In this way, you will be free to receive the full value and enjoyment of the relationship when you find the right woman you want to have a relationship with without the burden of guilt. I had a problem with her new point of view because it implied that using other people for her own pleasure and gain was acceptable to her. That was not the case for me. It was a side of her personality that I had never seen before. It made me change my perspective considerably. Answer me this question, my beloved wife, I said. Why is my open affair with your approval so important to you? Have I done something so disgusting to you that you want to find an excuse to destroy our marriage? After 5 minutes of silence, I turned the sound system back on. The lack of response spoke volumes. Grace always had an answer for everything. Now she was silent. I asked myself why. I now believe that my loving wife had a definite reason why she wanted me to have an affair. But why? Regardless of the reason, I now firmly believe that something was seriously wrong in our lives. I knew I had to find out exactly what it was. I had been driving for about an hour. We were about 40 miles from home when I saw my wife turn the sound off again. I reached for my jacket and turned on the recorder. I'm sorry, Ed, Grace said. I guess I've been reading too many Harlequin romance stories. Those ideas must have come from somewhere out of left field. With those words, she turned our sound system back on, figuring that would be the end of it. The problem was that our 3 kids and I knew she hated those books because they were her mother's favorite books. All her life she had called them trailer trash, and she was beyond that. Every time her mother handed her the last of her books, Grace would bring them home and throw them in the trash. After driving the last 40 miles, I realized that the one thing I didn't know much about was her Thursday nights with the girls. We didn't consider it something important or serious enough to worry about. On those rare occasions when I was home, she willingly changed her schedule to be home and with me. Until today, I had no reason to doubt those nights because I trusted her completely. The problem I had to face was that the conversation I just had gave me reason to question what those Thursday night bachelorette parties were all about. Was she going out with girls to bars and having questionable relationships like one-night stands? When I got home, I realized I had to find out what was going on during her bachelorette party. We pulled into our driveway as our kids did with my parents. When we got inside, I treated both of my parents to a rye and Coke. They told me about what they and the kids had done over the weekend. For my parents, the time spent with their grandchildren was invaluable. According to them, it was the grandchildren who helped them to stay young and modern. Each activity was organized with them in mind, so my parents were exposed to things they had never done before. They were there for about an hour, after which they headed home. I walked them both to the car. Ed, Dad asked quietly, when would be the best time for us to stop by your office tomorrow for a private conversation? I have interviews all day, I said. Let's say about 3 hours. Whatever the problem is, I'm here for you. The problem isn't with Mom and me, Dad said in a whisper. It concerns your wife and her youngest daughter. I'd better not say anything more since your wife is watching us. Okay, Dad, I can do it. I'll stop by your place after work and we can fix it in half an hour, I said loud enough for Grace to hear it through the window. After watching them drive away, I went inside and got my car keys. Then I took my toolbox and threw it in the trunk. Hi, honey, I said. I need to stop by my dad's tomorrow and make something for him after work, so I might be a few minutes late. I heard you from the window, Grace said. Don't worry, we can eat a little later. My dad showed up on time with my mom. They were escorted into my office. We sat down at the desk and waited for one of the staff to bring us coffee. As soon as the coffee was served, Kathy closed my office door, getting ready to leave. And my father said, I'm really sorry about my stupid prank of sending our grandchildren's DNA. They found a DNA match for April. She has a paternal grandmother who is looking for her son and his descendants. With those words, he pulled out a form from Ancestry.com. It contained the woman's name and phone number. I was devastated. My father, just by looking at me, realized how much the news had hit me. Dad, I don't think they made a mistake, so let's see what we can all figure out, I said. Using the office phone, I dialed the number and turned on the recording function and speaker. I wanted to make sure I had a permanent record of the conversation. The phone rang twice before it was answered. My name is Edward Paul Adams, and I'm looking for Mrs. Beatrice Smith from a DNA match found thanks to Ancestry.com, I said. May I speak to her, please? You're talking to her, young man, the woman said. How can I help you? It's complicated, I said. Long story short, my youngest daughter, as I just found out, is your granddaughter. You mean April Marie Adams, she asked. Yes, it is, I replied. Then perhaps you know my son, who I had to give up for adoption when I was only 15, she said. I might if I knew his name, I said. He was adopted by a family with the last name Barrow, and his middle name at the time was Luke Robert, Mrs. Smith said. My face turned white. Tears came to my parents' eyes because we knew the name well. Her honest, straightforward remark turned into a hellish nightmare for me. He's alive and well, I said. He's now a district attorney in Cape Girardeau County, Missouri. He is also my wife's boss. I can tell you that he's never been married, and now I think I know why. He's my only child, she said. I have stage 4 lung cancer and I don't have long to live. Would you allow your daughter April to visit me before I come to the end of my life? If you can't afford it, I'll gladly pay for the ticket. I'd like to meet her to give her my inheritance. Mrs. Smith, under the circumstances, I'll let you make arrangements with my parents. Since you are only one state away, they will take her on a special weekend trip so you can get to know her, I said. I don't think I would let my daughter go on a trip like that alone. Is there anything else you want me to do? Get me a notarized statement authorizing my attorney to conduct a DNA test, Mrs. Smith said. Because of the value of April's inheritance, he will want to make sure she is who we think she is before changing my will. No problem, I'll pass this call on to my father, I said. He can work out the details and get directions on how to get to you. I stood up, walked out of the office and handed Kathy my personal tape recorder, saying transcribe and notarize both my conversation and the phone conversation I'm still recording. I'll need them for the divorce court. Do you want me to process the authorization for the DNA test? Kathy asked. Katie was smart. She remembered that when I turned on the tape, she should listen in silence. In the past, this had been done and many conflicts were quickly resolved. Yes, I said. But we have to keep it a secret for a few weeks. I want to find out what my soon-to-be divorced wife does on Thursdays. I walked into my assistant's office and said, David, I need to speak with you and your wife as soon as possible. I'm going to need your cooperation on a personal matter. David looked at me and immediately realized that what I needed help with was very serious. She's about to be released from dispatch, David said. I'll text her to come right over. I went back to my office and we worked it out. Using my house key, they would pack April's clothes and leave the following Friday. I would pick her up from school and drop her off at their place by 10 o'clock. I was walking my parents to the exit when David's wife walked in. I told her to go to his office and I would join them shortly. Thanks to modern communications, Kathy already had copies made and transcribed. I gave a copy to David and Cheryl to read. I suggested that they first familiarize themselves with the conversation between my wife and me. I gave Kathy the paper my father had given me to make photocopies of what my father had received from my attorney's file that we were in the process of creating, and told her to find the best one for me. Both Cheryl and David had known my wife and me for many years. Both took what they learned today very hard. Cheryl and Grace grew up in each other's neighborhood. Although they were never close, they naturally knew everything about each other. She was shocked to learn the reality of what had remained unknown until now. Do you think there's any chance they're still lovers after all these years? Cheryl asked. Or was it one of those situations they got into and then realized their mistake? I don't know, but I'm going to need your cooperation to find out, I said. For the next few weeks, I need David to take the company car to travel to sales meetings. Cheryl, I'll need to drive your car because no one will be looking for it. So I need you to drive David's car. I'll let corporate know that we're doing this as part of your cross-training, David. So I'm afraid you'll have to do it for the next 3 months. You're going to follow your wife around on Thursday nights and write down everything you can, David said. Because your wife will still believe you make your weekly trips. My intuition tells me it's still going on. Because why would my wife suddenly suggest I have an affair with her blessing, I said. If Barrow hadn't changed jobs, nothing would have changed. I believe Grace may be planning to move in with Luke Robert Barrow when he starts working in St. Louis. If Grace could prove that I was having an affair, it would justify in her eyes filing for divorce. Shit, Cheryl said. I can see Grace doing something like that. It's become acceptable in our society to blame the opposition for something you've already done. It's an effective way to take your eyes off your own behavior. Add if you find proof on one of these Thursday evenings, Cheryl said. Call me and I'll have the dispatcher have a couple of blues call her and her lover and tell them you were in an accident. That way I can get a detailed police report on what state they were dressed or undressed in, and where they ended up. A few of the cops would like to get a little revenge on the DA for what he's done against them in the past. Kathy looked over and said, Dale Allen Britton left the DA's office 4 months ago because he could no longer work for him and opened his own practice. I faxed his office everything we have so far and he's expecting you. You'd better hurry. Ed, give Dale my regards and best wishes, Cheryl said. And tell him we still miss him. I walked out the door to meet the man who was on his way to the Supreme Court with the women's right to life movement because of Roe versus Wade. The way he looked at the law and how to apply it put everything he was involved with upside down. Things were getting clearer. Grace and I had started having marital problems right after she started working for Luke Barrow. That's when I was promoted to sales manager and had to start traveling 24 hours a day to meet with salespeople. If they were still having an affair every Thursday night, I had been their unknowing cuckold for over 15 years. They had to laugh at me behind my back. Now the expensive Christmas and birthday presents from Luke made sense. Dale was waiting for me when I got out of the car. I found out that Cheryl had called him about our plans. Dale had even supplied me with the key I needed to access Luke Barrow's house, and the code to disable the alarm system if it was set. He handed me a piece of paper with a phone number on it. At this number, he said, you will find those who can provide you with the service at a reasonable price. I have spoken to them and they are waiting for your call. He explained he grew up on the street and still has connections to pull some things off. The codes for the Barrow home, he said, will be in effect until the end of next week, and then Luke Barrow will receive a monthly reminder to change his access codes. He was going to sue Barrow for child support from the day April was born. Luke Barrow was going to have a lot of expenses. Under state law, you couldn't get rid of it by declaring bankruptcy. If Dale got his way, his former boss would be broke before he was done. He was going to sue my wife Grace, accusing her of adultery, abandonment and fraud for knowingly passing off Luke Barrow's daughter as mine. It was Dale who offered to temporarily transfer my parental rights to April to my parents until the court case was settled. I asked him why. Dale explained that way they couldn't say you were using April against them. I know Luke will go after you as dirty and sneaky as he can. He'll treat you the same way he treats all the lowlifes. Give them maximum time for the slightest offense. Sometimes the best offense is the greatest offense. I offered to use my debit card to prepay for his services and he said no, your wife will see it right away and can guess what you are doing. Write me a check and I will hold on to it until they are serviced. As soon as I left, I knew from his thoughts that everything he was doing was to give me an advantage in time to figure things out. Kathy really found the best thing for me. I was left with the impression that Dale had his own reason for pursuing Luke Barrow in this way. Both Grace and Luke were about to face shit they never thought possible. Dale Britton had just created his own version of the divorce game. I signed all the necessary paperwork for my parents to get parental rights to April as of Friday and gave them a copy. After Dale and I explained the whole situation to them, they agreed that it made sense. I was waiting for Cheryl to arrive in her 2002-year-old model Ford Taurus. David was going on his first sales trip. Cheryl would leave her car at my place and take David home. My oldest told me that their mom wouldn't be home for dinner, as she was going to join the girls right after work. As soon as Cheryl arrived, everything was switched over and I threw my suitcase in the trunk. Ed, Cheryl said. Dispatch and all the guys on board. All I need is to know where. Thanks, I said. Dale said to call him if things got going so he could personally serve them. I'd like to know why Dale wants Luke Barrow out. With Dale, it's a matter of principle, Cheryl said. Luke has trouble backing up what he says. It was interesting to watch Grace and Luke drive away in their cars. Both stopped at Charlie's Bar and Grill and had a first-class steak each. Then one went one way and the other went the other. I, on the other hand, just pulled up to Luke Barrow's house and waited. Dale's friends and my crew had already set up. I was in a safe place with a direct view of Luke's house. Grace was the first to show up. After entering the code into the box to disable the alarm, she used her own key to unlock the door. We filmed her long enough to see her enter the house. 10 minutes later, Luke pulled up. Grace opened the door to greet him. Her blouse was completely open and her bra was missing. Her full cleavage was on full display. Luke pulled Grace into his arms and gave her a deep, loving kiss. As they kissed, I noticed his hands began to play with her breasts. As soon as they closed the door, I stopped filming. 6 of the 8 rooms in Luke's house were wired for video and sound. Luke Barrow's neighbor's son was serving a long prison sentence. He agreed to let us use his house as a base. Everything that was filmed at the Barrow house was streamed live to all the Facebook pages they were connected to. We found out that I had a crew following my car because Grace believed I would take the bait and start looking for a new mistress as early as tonight. Since she knew my schedule, they hooked up with a prostitute they hired because she knew my taste. I texted Cheryl to let her know what I had just overheard. She called her husband David to let him know he was being followed. Being a former Marine, he took direct protective action and intentionally drove his car off the road at 10 o'clock at night. He then had to call a tow truck to get it out. He called his wife to report the accident. She texted me. I replied that everything was fine and gave her the address. While I waited to see what would happen, I slipped over to the Barrows house and took the valves out of all the tire rods on their car, because I didn't want them to have a chance to start cleaning up the mess they would be in. The lovers wouldn't be going anywhere for a long time. The police officers, flashing their blue lights, pulled up to the house and began looking for Grace Adams. Luke Barrows tried to deny her presence until the officers pointed out that her car was parked in the driveway. Finally, Grace appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a sheet. Mrs. Grace Adams, your husband Edward Paul's car was involved in an accident near Little Rock, Arkansas. It was your parents who offered to find you here when you couldn't be found. I took great pleasure in seeing Grace's face turn white. The policeman had deliberately lied to her to make them both uncomfortable. After that, the police officers got into their cruiser and drove off, and I followed them, keeping up with them. From the moment the police arrived until the moment they left, everything was recorded and streamed live on Facebook. We had proof that the case was ongoing, and so did the people of the Cape. At midnight, my oldest daughter Amy called. Daddy, Mom isn't home yet, and my calls are going to her answering machine. I'm starting to worry that she doesn't usually come in this late. What should I do? Call Luke Barrow and ask him to put you through to your mother, I said, sending her the number. What does her boss have to do with this? Amy asked. He's been her girlfriend on Thursdays for over 16 years, I said. I hung up and sent Amy part of a clip of Grace in a sheet talking to the cops and Luke Barrow, wearing nothing but pajama pants, from the burning phone. 10 minutes later, Amy called again and said, Mom's phone suddenly worked again. She called me. She said she was on Lower East Broadway with 4 flat tires. I realized she was lying and told her it couldn't be true, because it was right next door to Luke Barrow's house. She said she was telling me the truth, and I told her I saw a clip of her and her lover talking to the cops. She told me what the clip was and I sent it to her. Mom couldn't explain to me why she was wearing a sheet. I wasn't expecting her home for a few hours, but you could do me a favor and open the front door, I said. I was getting out of the car when my daughter Amy saw me. She watched me take my suitcase out of the trunk and walk toward her. No sooner had I set my suitcase on the floor than my cell phone rang. It was Dale Allen Britton. I answered it and put it on speaker. Ed, I just served them both at his house, Dale said. Now your wife and her lover are forbidden to come within 500 feet of you and your children. I will notify the Cape Police Department before I return home. Do yourself a favor, don't talk to her at all, Dale added. If she shows up even for clothes, call the police. Got it, and so did my oldest daughter, I said. Thanks, Dale. Amy, go open the garage so I can move Cheryl's car into it, I said. I have to be in Little Rock. That's what we did. Dad, is that why the locksmith came around 6 to change the locks? Asked Amy. Yeah, it was done at the last minute, I said. I got Kathy to order it because it was becoming obvious that it was going to go the way we planned. What brought this on? Asked Amy. The DNA test your grandfather sent to Ancestry.com, I said. They got a match on April. He told me about it at work on Monday. When I contacted the woman, it turns out your mother's boss is her son, who she gave up for adoption when she was 15. Amy, my daughter, lost her temper. I held her tightly until she calmed down. Then we turned off the lights and went into the kitchen to talk quietly. I turned on the tape recorder and let Amy listen to the conversation her mother and I had when we were driving back from Nashville. It was very informative to hear her mother's words from her own mouth. Why does Mom want you to have an affair, Dad? Amy asked. To negate the repercussions of what she did, should it be found out, I said. It's sad that her assumption led to the truth coming out. There was a quiet knock on the door. Since I wasn't supposed to be home, Amy answered it. It was a police officer who informed us that they had stopped the cab Grace was in, and told her that she would be violating a court order if she drove on. My eldest daughter and I discussed all of this for the rest of the evening. We both agreed that Grace should have been a writer, because she always had a story to tell about her girlhood. I still can't believe Mom had an ongoing affair with the same man for over 16 years, Amy said. Why didn't we see that? That was easy, I said. You kids were young. I was a sales manager who had to travel regularly to different states for meetings every week. Out of trust in us as a couple, I saw no reason not to give your mom my blessing for weekly night outings with the girls. We all trusted her, Amy said. That's what made us blind to what was going on behind the scenes. I sat stunned. If my daughter hadn't said that, I never would have seen it. She was the one who had used our trust in her that had allowed her to go unpunished for so long. Amy saw the tears filling my eyes and said, "That's what hurts the most. It's not the cheating or the lying. It's the realization that she used our beliefs about her deliberately as a tool to continue the only relationship that meant anything to her." If your mother did that to someone she claimed to love, I said, imagine what she'll do to us when she starts hating us for what she's going through. Amy got up to make us both a fresh cup of coffee. At that moment, I realized that dawn had already begun. A text notification came to my phone. "It's from your mom. She'd like to be able to talk to me as soon as possible," I said. "She says that my eldest and I have some family issues that we need to discuss before I return from my trip." "How are you going to respond to her?" my daughter asked worriedly. "Don't worry. Be happy, Luke, and you can still laugh at the big dumbass behind my back," I said as I wrote this. "You can still move to St. Louis with Luke Barrow, which was your plan all along. Just not with our kids." Amy looked at me in utter shock. "Your mother doesn't need me anymore," I said. My usefulness to her was exhausted. She wanted me to have an affair so she could use it against me in divorce court. She didn't think for a second that after all this time she'd be caught. It must have been very painful for Amy to hear the words I wrote to her mother. Not many people are able to recognize the pure truth about anything. Most will call the one who reveals it all the nasty names they know because the real truth hurts. In time they will accept it. I stood up and took my daughter in my arms as she began to shed tears again. We managed to calm her down before we heard Eric and April stirring. I turned on the TV in the kitchen to channel Cavos 12 to watch the local morning news like I always did. Soon they were having breakfast to start the day. They were surprised to see me at home. We were all surprised to see an image of my wife on the screen. My son turned up the volume out of curiosity. At that moment, I felt sorry for my children because Luke and she were discussing how stupid and dumb I was. Grace said bluntly, "That fool is such a moron and he doesn't notice everything going on around him." Then their mother made a sarcastic remark about me, which made them both burst into laughter. Then the reporter spoke. "I don't think they're laughing anymore," he said, after watching 5 hours of the longtime lover's Facebook behavior live. Their plan to set Edward Adams up with a professional prostitute so she would divorce him and take everything he had blew their minds. In the next scene, Dale sues them both. The reporter explained what the lawsuits were for. Alice just ran over to me and sat on my lap sobbing. It was a hell of an unpleasant way for a 16-year-old girl to find out that her father was not her biological father, but her mother's longtime lover. Eric summed it up by saying, "If you're just a piece of shit in your mom's eyes, what does that do to the rest of us?" Once April calmed down, Amy helped me explain what had happened since my mom and I got back from Nashville. I called the school and asked them to release them from school for Friday and Monday to give them time to adjust and deal with their emotions. We were about to start breakfast when April said, "Daddy, the chief of police is coming." That got our attention and we turned up the volume again. It has now been publicly announced that both Grace Adams and Luke Barrow, our current district attorney, are being criminally prosecuted. A task force from across the county is being assembled to investigate. I thought that when a person's behavior becomes public, the masses cannot publicly accept what they do privately. Hypocrisy rules our society every day. After breakfast and cleaning up, I sat my 3 children down at the table. I showed each of them a copy of the letter my father had received. Then I said, "April, my parents are picking you up to take you to meet your biological father's mother. She is dying of cancer and has asked to meet with you. There's a very good reason for that, but I think it's best to have the woman you're meeting with explain it to you. As far as I'm concerned, you are my daughter and always will be. Other than that, if you have any questions, ask your grandparents. Amy, will you help your sister pack for the weekend while I call my parents?" I asked. As soon as the girls left, my son asked, "How do you handle it, Daddy?" "No," I replied. "I find myself in a constant struggle to keep my cool. Remember, son, if this ever happens to you as a father, you have to stay strong for all the other people in your life." With these words, I called my parents and explained where I was. They said they would come as soon as they finished loading the car. They still had an hour before they had to catch their plane. I didn't realize that it was at that moment that my son and I's relationship was forever changed for the better. The three of us watched the daughter I had raised leave with my parents to see her biological grandmother for the first time. I prayed above all that everything would go well, and that she would return with the same feelings I had. The DA's office looks like a morgue. Grace Adams went shopping for new clothes after her car was towed and 4 tires replaced. Luke Barrow read the lawsuit filed against him. Although they didn't have a direct DNA sample, they had linked him biologically in such a way that there was no way he could deny his parentage. Now all the staff knew the truth about their relationship and years-long affair. This, and the fact that they had hidden April Adams' true background, was becoming a political nightmare. Under the law, the term fraud was eventually expanded to include the failure to disclose all material facts about a situation. Because of this, Dale filed a civil suit against Grace and against him together. It was looking more and more like they as a couple had been defrauding her husband Ed for years. All the lawyers he had approached said that Ed Adams and Dale Britton would succeed. The same attorneys he had approached so far wanted nothing to do with it. Most of them had already heard what Dale had done the last time he appeared as a defendant. It was noted that most offenses are based on the assumption that a scheme of certain facts will be presented in such a way that they can be challenged. In Dale's case, when he made his arguments in court, most found that by the time he was done, they had no defense. The exposure of their behavior on Facebook and the apparent admission by the two that they were trying to destroy an honest man so that together they could seize as much of his estate as possible would have meant little. But because of his position in the community, it became front-page news. Grace had just walked out of a store she had been going to for years because of the quality and uniqueness of the clothes. The last thing she expected was to run into a woman who would ask if she was crazy because she should have known it would end badly. When Grace asked what the woman was talking about, she learned that the woman said she had been a freaking porn star on Facebook for at least 5 hours. She returned to Luke's house around 1 p.m. and found that the company had just finished service. They mistook her for the homeowner and suggested that her husband and her reset all the security codes in the house. It wasn't until they left that she realized she hadn't been asked to confirm with an electronic signature that they were there. She called Luke and asked who wanted to make sure he didn't take the new position in St. Louis. When he asked why, she told him what she had come back for. Then they began to believe that Ed was just protecting himself because they both knew that his new job was a political appointment from the deep state. After making herself some coffee, she sat down at the table and looked over the divorce petition. The first blow was dealt when she learned that it was her words to her husband that had made him suspicious. Her husband was perplexed as to why she was asking him to intentionally hurt and use another human being for her own personal gratification. But it was Mom and Dad Adams who informed him of the DNA match. This allowed him to determine April's true origins and was undeniable proof that she was having an affair. Grace began to realize that Ed must now know that it was her behavior that almost caused their breakup before April was even born. At that moment, she realized that Ed must know that it was still going on. It was Ed who was behind what had happened last night. It was Ed who was revealing the hidden facts of her life. As she took another sip of coffee, the doorbell rang. She stood up, walked to the front door and opened it, finding that it was the neighbor Luke didn't like. "Mr. Primrose," she said. "What can I do for you?" He handed her an envelope of legal documents and said, "Ed, your husband used my apartment as a base of operations for his operations against you and your longtime lover last night. I was happy to let him do it because Luke Barrow got my son the maximum sentence as a first-time offender. I thought you might be interested to know that the information in the envelope I gave you last night will also be delivered by courier to everyone I know on your side of the family this afternoon." Ed asked me to ask if you are laughing at him now. She watched him walk away with the biggest smile on her face. Back in the kitchen, Grace opened the envelope. It was filled with pictures. They began with her letting Luke into the house with her own key. Then she meets him at the door when he comes home. There's sexual foreplay in the living room. The photos left nothing out. Even police officers were captured in them. Ed's team were professionals. The elimination had been so complete that it now felt like he was working with a bunch of cops who wanted revenge on Luke for their own reasons. But it was the last printed page, signed by her husband, that said it all. If it became public, there would be a whole host of problems they weren't prepared for. Her plans to force her husband to submit to her wishes had fallen to pieces. The question now was how to minimize the damage done by Ed, turning this into a public spectacle. Grace, last Sunday when we got home from Nashville, I realized that you were trying to set me up to divorce me. Since then, I confess, I've been trying to figure out what I did to make your love for me turn to pure hatred. Now I know why. I see that you blame me for what you think was missing in your life when we only had 2 children. I think you felt trapped in your marriage and wanted your carefree bachelor life back. Otherwise, you wouldn't have turned to him to rediscover the single life. By doing so, you allowed him to take you away from what you hated for a few hours a week. I know that the only reason you stayed married to a man you hated and thought was dead was because Luke didn't want to take on the responsibility of raising children, even his own. With your opinion of me, there's no way you'd leave them alone with a piece of shit like me. Your pride wouldn't have allowed it. As a result, you've lived a lifetime of deliberate lies. Every day you both got away with it in your contempt for who and what I am grew. In your eyes, I became more and more of a fool and an idiot. How many times have you and Luke laughed at this unrepentant bastard? Did you inspire him to make love to you by humiliating or ridiculing me? What I can't forgive or forget is what you and the one you consider your real husband sent to our children because it will affect them for the rest of their lives. I can't understand how Luke and you had fun playing with me and our children's lives as if we were just chess pieces on a game board. News reporter Kevus12 summed it up well when he asked you two if you were laughing at Grace Adams' husband Edward Adams right now. I watched Amy, Eric and April as you and your lover, thanks to the media, flaunted what you planned to do to me. It was horrible watching our children as you joked and laughed about how easy it would be to take down this stupid goon. Eric, our only son, said, if our mother thinks you're just a piece of shit that needs to be allowed to dry before hammering you into the ground, what does she really think of us? I have not asked them what your relationship with them will be in the future. At this point, I can honestly say they don't exist. It was your and your lover Luke's utter disgust and contempt for me that led to this. At least we both know you're laughing with joy because you've left me with a reputation as a hapless goofball for the rest of my life. Perhaps tonight you can both raise a glass to victory. Eddie Grace's hands trembled so violently that she dropped the paper. She looked like an angry, bitter, hateful and cruel bitch. It was obvious that she appeared to her readers as a mother who didn't care about her children, her husband, or any other human being. The only thing she cared about was herself and the fulfillment of her carnal needs. Then her sobs broke the silence in the room. Edie was the only person she knew capable of destroying a person's credibility without directly condemning them. Everyone who read her couldn't argue with his comments about their behavior. In his eyes, everything she'd ever done was about prolonging life, not love. He should have known that Luke was the one pressuring her to leave him and the kids before April got pregnant. It was Luke's new job that made them change their long-term plans. Originally, they were going to wait until April graduated from high school. Then her true origins could be revealed without any repercussions. He was right about something because she wasn't laughing right now. He didn't fail to point out that their own behavior proved his point. Edie believed that their contempt for who and what he was explained their attempt to destroy him completely. It was a declaration of war. If he was going to go down, he was going to take them both with him. Grace picked up the divorce petition and continued reading. It was truly crushing. One of the lawsuits against them was for fraud because they had concealed April's true origins. She was accused of emotional and mental abandonment, adultery, and defamation. But when she looked at the amount they were demanding for damages in the fraud case, she felt sick to her stomach. If he won, both Luke and she would be penniless for a very long time. Ed and his lawyer argued that they could no longer treat Ed as the jackass they thought he was. Saturday was crazy for me and my 2 older kids. From early morning until 4 in the afternoon, we had family visiting us. Grace's parents, her 2 brothers, 1 sister, and their spouses came to support us. Everyone brought one of their favorite dishes so we would have something to eat. Even my brother and sister came from out of town to check on me. The 3 of us were overwhelmed with love and support. Each of the people who came had a hard time understanding how they could have been deceived by Grace for so long. They all agreed that what appeared on social media was proof that she was trying to destroy me out of hate. My father-in-law and I grabbed a cold beer and went out on the back patio for a few minutes. Edward let him go, he said. Cora's in the house so you can have some privacy and we'll keep them away until you calm down. He stayed with me until things sorted themselves out. Cora and I plan to change our will, he said. What should have been Grace's will be divided among your 3 children. She may be our daughter, but I'll never forgive her for what she's become. We had just finished clearing out the house when my dad called. April met this lady, my father said. You can definitely see some family resemblance. Their meeting went well. Mrs. Smith seemed interested in your family situation and got April to openly tell her how she felt about it. That was good to see because she had been keeping things to herself. The lawyer got the blood sample he needed and then invited me in for a private conversation, my father said. He asked me about Luke Barrow and I told him what we all knew. I learned that his real father was in prison for life for killing his mistress's husband. Luke would have been left his real mother's inheritance if April hadn't come into her life. Don't worry, Dad, I replied. Dale Britton got a court order banning him from being within 500 feet of either of us. It was a busy day with many family members from both sides coming to offer their support. We were lodged at Mrs. Smith's estate as her guests. Your mother felt honored to be treated so regally, Dad explained. April is staying with Mrs. Smith now. We both like her. Her lawyer said he hasn't seen a smile on the grand old lady's face in a long time. Hold on, I'll put your mom on the phone. Ed, I got a chance to talk to Beatrice alone for a bit. She asked me what kind of son you were and I talked about your life in general, trying to be as frank and honest as I could. We talked in great detail about what had happened over the past week. She told me that you left it up to her to tell April why she wanted to see her. She said it had been a long time since a stranger had shown her such respect, and then thanked all of us for telling her how to handle her estate situation. My mom continued. She plans to leave everything in a trust in April's name for you to manage until she turns 25. Text me when you leave so I can be there when you bring her home, I asked before hanging up. I texted April to say we all miss you and send hi to Dad. We finally had time to get everything in order before David and Cheryl arrived in my car. I had to apologize to her for forgetting to return it. The police chief sees a chance to take out Luke Barrow, Cheryl said. He and Dale are working together. Dale has handed him some questionable items for the investigators to look into. When I got back, all the staff were gloomy and upset, David says. I told them in general terms that some of us had been aware of what was going on for most of the week and had helped in any way we could. It's been an emotional roller coaster around here since Thursday night, I said. The kids still have a hard time dealing with it at times, so I'm taking Monday off too. Have you heard anything about Grace? Cheryl asked. Not since Thursday night, I replied. Luke and her are probably busy doing their own thing since they've made it publicly clear how they feel about us. My youngest daughter called me early Sunday morning and asked if she and her grandparents could come home late on Monday. I gave my blessing if her grandparents would agree. She thanked me for making her go. I asked why. April said that Mrs. Smith made me accept the fact that it was not my fault that her mother's infidelity had brought me into the world. Mrs. Smith made Daddy understand that we were all innocent victims and didn't deserve what her son's and my mother's behavior had brought upon us. I love you, Daddy, she said before ending the conversation. On Monday night, Amy, Eric, and I watched my mom and Dad pull into our driveway. My parents looked stressed and tired. As soon as she got out of the car, she immediately rushed into my arms. I had to admit it was nice to have my youngest daughter home. Her father opened the trunk and brought in her suitcase. Eric immediately carried it into her bedroom. Then the 3 of them went to the family room so April could tell them about her new grandmother. This gave my parents and I a chance to catch up. We went into the kitchen. While I made fresh coffee, my parents told me about their impression of Mrs. Beatrice Smith. When we left, she was calm, my father said. It was like she had reached a point where she was ready to accept her death. Meeting April and having April accept her was important to her. Mom pulled an envelope of legal documents out of her purse and handed it to me, explaining, this was given to me by her lawyer, per Beatrice's instructions. I opened it and pulled out the letter. Opening the first thing I noticed was a check for $50,000. The letter was short and to the point. The great lady thanked me for granting her request. She was informing me that before I contacted her, she had already lived beyond her life expectancy. DNA confirmed the biological connection. April is a beautiful girl. You have raised her well. Use the resources I have given you to get through the difficult time you are going through. And don't forget your values. I gave it to my parents to read. It was hard to realize that my parents and I may have fulfilled a man's dying request. Over a cup of coffee, I explained to them everything that had happened while they were on the trip. I told them that I felt that emotionally, everything was behind us as a family, and that we would be back to our normal way of life starting tomorrow. The rest of the week went smoothly. Grace tried to contact each of our children by cell phone and was told not to call again. The corporate headquarters was thrilled that I was no longer leading sales meetings and began looking for a sales manager for the first time in 10 years. I was sitting in my office going over the month's sales figures when Kathy poked her head through the door saying, "Shit hit the fan." I looked up at her and asked, "What now?" "I received a letter informing me that your latest letter to Grace was published on a Southeast Missouri newspaper website." I went to the website and found the Speak Out section to open it. Katie came over to my desk and started reading, looking over my shoulder. By the time she finished reading, she was sobbing. "I wrote it when I was emotionally upset," I explained. "Maybe I was being too harsh." "No, Ed," Kathy said. "You just coldly and bluntly stated what her long-term behavior shows. Either one of them could have gotten over it and come clean. Luke got the benefit of a long-term relationship without the cost." "That's what I thought," I said. "It's not often that the community at large gets to see what someone's behavior costs a family, and in such a public way," Katie says. "For anyone who has been divorced like me, it's a stark reminder of the pain and suffering they had to go through before they could start living again." "Look at that last comment," I said as I read it aloud. "As a feminist for most of my life, I have fought for equality and empowerment. What this woman and her lover did to her husband and children has forever tarnished our movement." Grace and Luke were having dinner at Charlie's Bar and Grill. The place is usually packed to capacity on Friday nights, but tonight there were only empty tables around them. When they asked the waitress why, she explained that there were people waiting for us who refused to show up publicly near you. The waitress said it was probably because many people had read the publication of your husband's last letter to you, Mrs. Adams, on the Southeast Missourian's website. Grace and Luke asked for the bill and quickly left, knowing that they had better stay as far away from society as possible in the near future. Both of them had to accept that their world had shrunk considerably because of their behavior. As they were leaving, Grace noticed her mother and father sitting at a table waiting for their order. Grace headed toward them. Luke followed her. When she spoke, her father looked at them and said, "Mr. Barrow, I suggest you get your whore out of here and let my wife and I eat in peace." Grace left the restaurant in tears, finally realizing that if she went too far, there was no turning back. She had to live with the consequences of what she and Luke had done for the rest of her life. When they got back to Luke's place, they went to the website and saw for themselves what was being written in the comments. It was clear to both of them that the public hated them both. 3 months later, I sat in the passenger seat of my car and watched April drive. We had left this morning to go to Wichita, Kansas, since we had learned that her grandmother Beatrice had passed away. We were on our way to the airport to take the private jet that the estate provided us. April was having a hard time with this, as they had grown close through constant phone calls to each other when she returned from her trip. Amy and Eric helped me a lot, and all 4 of us became closer as a result. They both encouraged me to start dating, but I kind of kept quiet about it. Once burned, twice embarrassed. Luke and Grace were now living in St. Louis. The feds had authorized him to start work early. The county was happy to get rid of him early if he paid back over $45,000 in questionable expenses. They were now living in a rented 2-bedroom apartment in case they had to declare bankruptcy because of an impending civil suit. Under Missouri bankruptcy laws, they could only keep $10,000 each. Our divorce was finalized in accordance with state law. Grace was to pay me child support while they were in school and cover 50% of their living expenses if they lived on campus. The civil fraud trial was due in 2 weeks. My children still refused to talk to their mother, as did her relatives. She had experienced firsthand that people can take so much crap that they then leave for good. April had to endure a meeting with her biological father, organized by the state child welfare agency. It did not go well for him. She told him that his mother had told her that he, like his real father, was a drug addict who should not be allowed near any woman. In the presence of child welfare officials, April told him that both her mother and he were dead in her eyes. We attended her grandmother's funeral. Afterward, the lawyer revealed to both of us how large her inheritance was. It was overwhelming for both of us. As trustee, after discussing it with our daughter, We decided to sell her grandmother's house with all the contents except for personal jewelry and a few photographs that April wanted to take. We got home. The school year was winding down. I was getting ready for the first day of court on Wednesday when April walked into the den. "Dad, can you arrange for Luke, Mom, and their lawyers to meet with the two of us and Dale on Tuesday?" April said. "I think so, but why?" I asked. "I want them to see the real cost of their actions," April says. "Grandma Beatrice suggested that to me. Called Dale and we made a deal." It was a beautiful sunny day as we sat with Luke, Grace, and their attorneys. "I requested this meeting," April said. "To my biological father, I want to inform him of the following: the whereabouts of your father and his request to visit him in prison. He is serving a life sentence for the murder of his mistress's husband. You must realize that you are the product of a rape committed by a distant cousin when she was 14 years old." April handed him a sealed envelope with his name on it. I savored the expression that appeared on Luke and Grace's faces. "You both should know that my biological grandmother left me over $100 million to be held in trust for my father, Edward Adams, until I turned 25. It would have been your Luke if she hadn't discovered me," April stated. "When she found out how I was created and what came of it, her views on morals and standards snapped. That's when she discharged you. In my grandmother's eyes, what you both did was disgusting. Dale Britton, my trust, will be paying my father's legal bills," April said. "Luke and Mom, you can try to reconcile before you go to court because if we have to, we'll go all the way to the Supreme Court. Mom, you have to realize that even though you created me in sin, that doesn't give you the right to deem it acceptable. Thankfully, my biological grandmother made me realize that it is my father's views on morals, principles, and standards that make me." Yeah. I left that meeting both proud and humbled. My daughter had said it all. What would happen tomorrow didn't matter because today I was blessed with what really mattered. That's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If so, subscribe to my channel and